The White House will not take part in future House hearings in the impeachment inquiry. President Trump faced a 5 p.m. Eastern deadline to reply to House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler's offer to participate. We have the letter from the White House right here. It is addressed to the Honorable Gerald Nadler, Chairman, Committee on the Judiciary. Dear Chairman Nadler, as you know, your impeachment inquiry is completely baseless and has violated basic principles of due process and fundamental fairness. Nevertheless, the Speaker of the House yesterday ordered House Democrats to proceed with articles of impeachment before your committee has heard a single shred of evidence. House Democrats have wasted enough of America's time with the charade. You should end this inquiry now and not waste even more time with additional hearings. Adopting articles of impeachment would be a reckless abuse of power by House Democrats and would constitute the most unjust, highly partisan, and unconstitutional attempt at impeachment in our nation's history. Whatever course you choose, as the president has recently stated, if you are going to impeach me, do it now, fast, so we can have a fair trial in the Senate and so that our country can get back to business. Signed, Pat A. Cipollone, counsel to the president. It was also CC'd to the Honorable Doug Collins, ranking member. So, again, the White House will not participate in any further impeachment trial hearings coming out of the House. And joining us now is CBS News legal analyst Kim Wehle, who joins me by phone. So, Kim, the White House had kind of been signaling that this was the decision it was going to make. No real surprises here, correct?
No real surprises because, first of all, they want to retain their defense that somehow procedurally this is unfair, although, of course, that's getting harder and harder given that they had the opportunity that they've turned down now to call fact witnesses. And secondly, there really isn't an alternative narrative, alternative story that holds water. We see that Rudy Giuliani's running around Ukraine right now trying to hatch a video series to basically give some life to this debunked theory that it was really Ukrainian corruption relating to the 2016 presidential process, which is why Trump asked for the favor of Zelensky. That's been debunked even by the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee. So I think the White House is deciding that their best strategy is to just let the table be set as it is and not try to mount a defense on the facts because there really isn't one. So,
Kim, what does this do then to the Republicans' argument that this entire inquiry has been one-sided and the president has not had an opportunity to defend himself? I mean, doesn't this, just blow that argument out of the water?
Absolutely. It does that to people that are paying attention and that are looking at this objectively and rationally, frankly. But that doesn't mean that, it's a very complicated fact pattern in terms of the various players where, there's breaking news all the time. Most people aren't following it with the level of care that people in the news are. And so when they hear, listen, this is unfair, that narrative is believed, even if it's not accurate. So if there's one thing in terms of actually objectively looking at this, of course, if you look at the House resolution that gave rise to the offer to bring witnesses, it's very broad. The president on Monday could actually be calling fact witnesses in his defense relating to the July 25th call and the circumstances, has decided not to do that. But I think, as I said, he's betting, probably in part, on this notion people will believe the rhetoric, will believe, frankly, to some degree, propaganda, the sound bites, and not look behind at the actual facts here.
So it's almost as if he's said this is such a one-sided inquiry that I'm going to show the American people how one-sided it is, that even when I have the opportunity to represent myself or have some of my, witnesses testify, I'm not going to take it. But probably, like you just said, gambling on the fact that most people are not watching the details that closely, and then they just see, a room full of Democrats arguing for the president's impeachment.
Right. It's almost a strategy that makes the impeachment process unreliable or illegitimate in a way, because he's saying, listen, I'm not going to actually engage in it as a fact-finding inquiry. And that kind of makes sense, given that Pat Cipollone, at the same time he's saying this is so unfair, has stonewalled not just Congress, but the American people in terms of not responding to subpoenas for documents, to subpoenas for testimony. I mean, this is about one of the most sobering, serious things that can happen to our republic. And the president and the White House are essentially saying, we won't give information to the American people so that they can put the facts on the table and make a decision through their representatives as to how serious it is. I mean, for sure, the Democrats are operating with one hand tied behind their back, but that's really largely because the White House has stonewalled in ways that are really unprecedented. This notion that there's unlimited testimonial immunity, the ability to say, I won't show up to court or to Congress if you're worked for President Trump. I mean, both Presidents Nixon and President Clinton went to the Supreme Court claiming they had absolute testimonial immunity. Supreme Court twice said you do not, President, have the ability to basically say, I'm not ever talking to an investigator. If the president of the United States does not have that kind of immunity, how is it that people who worked for the president could have it? It just doesn't make logical sense.
So, Kim, looking ahead to the timeline for the House Judiciary Committee, this probably isn't going to affect things all that much because, 50-50 chance this was going to happen. So clearly they will have a plan in place to move forward. What do you think next steps will be?
Well, we'll see. Probably the lawyers who participated in the questioning make basically what amount to some level of closing argument, to sort of wrapping up the facts. We might see some debate on the contents of what should actually be in the document. Of course, the next stage is to actually produce a written piece of paper that has the charges listed on it, sort of like, an indictment coming out of a grand jury. And that's a really important piece of paper because we've been speculating sort of, is this a fair inquiry? Is there sufficient evidence, for, so to speak, to impeach a president when we don't even know what the charges are? So I think once we have that actual document and discussions of it, at least we have a common ground, a common playing field to determine, for example, is it bribery? Is bribery alleged? Is there an actual crime alleged? Is it just abuse of power? Are we looking beyond Ukraine back to the Mueller investigation and the acts of obstruction relating to that investigation? All of that, I think, in a way, might bring at least some clarity. And then, of course, after that, after the House votes, the Judiciary Committee will vote, then the full House will vote, and then it'll go to the Senate, and we'll have to see what the Republican-led Senate does with respect to a trial, if at all.
And Kim, so now we know, without a doubt, that the White House does not plan to participate. We could get a little bit more insight into their strategy moving forward. But what can you tell us about, from what you read in this letter and from what you've seen from the counsel, Pat Cipollone, his actions so far, what do you think their legal strategy will be going forward to defend the president?
I think the legal strategy will be to create an impression that is insufficient evidence, that it was too fast, the process is limited, confined, sort of what we heard my co-legal analyst, Jonathan Turley, the arguments that he made in testifying on the Hill, and essentially makes the argument that, listen, we don't have direct evidence that the president was behind this. Maybe in light of the questions about Ukraine that are, of course, false. There aren't any legitimate questions about Ukraine interfering in 2016. But we're seeing members of Congress, we're seeing members of the Senate, Mitch McConnell and others sort of kind of adding, putting fuel to that fire. I think the argument's going to be, listen, the president was in good faith engaging in foreign policy in asking the President Zelensky to conduct investigations because he was worried about Ukrainian influence in the 2016 election. Of course, that's debunked for a number of reasons. One is, if he was so worried about that, we have the best intelligence services on the planet. He could have used his own domestic teams of analysts and prosecutors and law enforcement officials to actually do that investigation. And then secondly, we've had witnesses who said that the investigation itself wasn't the issue. The issue, Gordon Sondland, for example, said the issue was just announcing the investigations, which makes it clear it's a purely political request to basically, harm Joe Biden's candidacy for president. But that's what we're going to see. We're going to see this painted as, Donald Trump-like routine foreign policy. If it were any other person, maybe they'd be sunk. But Donald Trump, we all know he does things. He acts kind of kooky, and this was part and parcel of that. And the Democrats don't have enough,
right.
Which, of course, is was, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of a heads we win, tails you lose type proposition if they're not going to cooperate. And I do think that we should, as Americans, have the full facts. I think that's very, very unfortunate, in fairness to the president as well as in fairness to the American people.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think that, just to elaborate on what you were saying, part of the strategy does seem to be this hope that the American people are not following all that closely and not really connecting the dots as you just laid them out. Because if you aren't following everything that's transpired from, Rudy Giuliani and his Ukrainian cohorts, if you haven't followed the entire story carefully, you could just step back and say, yeah, I see a room full of Democrats maligning the president, right?
Right, and meanwhile, you have Republican members of Congress, as well as certain media outlets, planting this question as to the false narrative maybe being real. I worked in the Whitewater investigation that led to the impeachment of Bill Clinton. Of course, he wasn't removed from office. But back then, there were a very narrow set of media outlets, and there are standards of journalism, as you know personally, that people apply to themselves to make sure that, as journalists, when things are reported, it's accurate, that what is being stated was checked as a matter of fact. And those standards with the internet, with social media, with, of course, Vladimir Putin creating false narratives that then get circulated to people's telephones, we now have two sets or more of facts. We have the actual facts that you mentioned, and then we have this falsehood. And it's hard for people, regular people, with how fast the digital generation has gone, to really be able to determine fact from fiction. And I do think that plays very well into the hands of, I think, a sort of a not necessarily honest defense of the president, but certainly it also plays into the hands of, the Russians and Vladimir Putin, who Mr. Mueller and Fiona Hill and others, the overwhelming consensus of our national security forces is that this is going on for 2020. That there is interference in 2020.
Absolutely, and that is, like you said, all of our intelligence agencies are telling us that. As a mother of two children who are often on the internet, I say to them, consider the source. That is always the most important thing when you're getting your information off the internet. Consider the source. Where is it coming from? Where is it originating?
Excellent advice. And I add to that, I'm a mother of four, and I say, read the original source document.
Exactly.
Like I said for today, read the memo that Pat Cipollone issued. Read it for yourself.
Exactly.
That's one example.
All right. Kim Wehle, thank you so much for your legal insight on all of this.